David Bowie is possibly music's greatest icon. He has produced one of the finest and most diverse discographies in history, spanning all the way from the late 1960s up until his death in 2016. But his contributions to society transcend well beyond the strict confines of music. As just to list a few examples of his positive actions, many see Bowie as being one of the spearheads for the recognition and normalisation of LGBT people's civil liberties, as well as being a vanguard in eliminating the residues of racism still entrenched within the music scene at the time, and also speaking out strongly against fascism despite some crass jests early in his career, where he proclaimed Hitler as the first rock star. Bowie has also given much of his estate, both in his lifetime and still now well after his death, to charities supporting disadvantaged children, human rights, poverty, hunger, and disaster relief, just to name a few. Despite this, something that a vocal minority have been pushed into mainstream discourse since Bowie's death is his contentious history as a child predator, with these worrying avertments being centred around an alleged sexual relationship and statutory rape of 14-year-old Lori Maddox, who has herself given several detailed interviews over the years about their apparent relationship. These several interviews with Lorie have fueled nearly all of the existing discourse on the subject matter, and are hence crucial sources of information that need to be scrutinised closely in order to find out whether or not Bowie can be ascertained as a child predator. Lorie's several different claims about her relationship with Bowie have never been thoroughly corroborated and examined on this platform, and in an age of misinformation that we find ourselves in, I feel it is important to critically appraise the validity of these interviews as accurate and reliable sources of information, especially considering the gravity these claims hold. I am a firm believer in the notion of innocent until proven guilty, whether that guilt is to be found at the judicial level, or if such guilt can be deduced beyond reasonable doubt through a private investigation, such in the case of my recent video that outed Anthony Kiedis as a bona fide sexual predator. Unfortunately though, it feels like quite a large demographic like to depart from this notion of innocence until proven guilty, as many folks are willing to condemn someone for a crime and smear their name even if the claim against the person is unproven or unattested. For example, the American Independent, a hugely influential liberal news website with a reported monthly reach of 140 million readers, published a piece in 2016 which presented Bowie's sexual relations with an underage Lori Maddox as a comprehensively factual event that 100% happened, with absolutely zero acknowledgement of the fact that the claim at this point is still just an unconfirmed allegation. Just look at the language used here by the article writer Michelle Keep, who asserts that Bowie definitively took advantage of a young girl he knew was legally unable to consent. Michelle doesn't even try to use ambiguous adverbs like allegedly or supposedly when discussing the subject, making this piece, in my eyes, completely libelous. Furthermore, the article used just one of Lorie's many interviews as a single source to validate the entire claim. Unfortunately, this article is just one example of many, as this Dr. Rebecca Hines article and Writers Without Money piece, which I pulled together from just a quick Google search on the matter, again follow the same dogmatic outlook, centred around one or maybe two interview sources to condemn Bowie as a bona fide child predator. So with all this considered, that is why in this video I will be collating each of Lorie's many different interviews and coalescing them all together so we can comprehensively assess Lorie's claims. I will examine each interview both individually in order to corroborate that individual interview's factual merit and accuracy, such as by date checking certain events for example, and then I will cross-examine each of the interviews in order to test Lorie's credibility and consistency as a reliable storyteller. So, let's get into it. First though, let's get to grips with who Lori Maddox is. Lorie was born on the 29th of November 1958, being raised by a single mother in Los Angeles, California, and she was, by her own admission, a fervent groupie. She was part of a crowd of girls in the 1970s known as baby groupies, which, for those not aware, were underage minors, usually between the ages of 12 to 16, who actively pursued sex from rock stars. As insane as his premise sounds in 2024, the scene was somewhat accepted as standard practice at the time, as deplorable as it sounds, and young girls were even actively encouraged to participate in this appalling subculture. Just look at this excerpt of a June 1973 issue of Star magazine, or this quiz in the March 1973 issue of Star as just a couple of candid examples. Now we've got that out of the way, let's move on to Lorie's first version of her story about her sexual encounter with David Bowie. So, we'll start with Lorie's interview with Thrillist.com that took place in late 2015, shortly before Bowie's death in January of 2016. It is probably Lorie's most well-regarded interview about Bowie, and stands as her principal interview on the topic, seeing as it has moulded and influenced much of the current discourse around the subject. So Lorie first contends that she was not yet 15 when she first met Bowie. This is the first issue with her story. So, if she was 14 at the time of their initial meeting, then this would have to have occurred after the 29th of November 1972 and before the 29th of November 1973, considering her birthday was, as noted before, on November 29th, 1958, as I'll show you in this table, which, be prepared, will be getting much more convoluted as we continue on. At this time then, Bowie would have been on the Ziggy Stardust tour, which took place from January 1972 to July 1973, and Bowie was only in California, which was the only US state where Lorie frequented gigs, for his first stretch of the tour in October 1972, when he played in Santa Monica on the 20th and 21st of October, and San Francisco on the 27th and 28th of October. And then he returned to California on his final leg of the tour in March 1973, where he played at Long Beach on the 10th of March and West Hollywood on the 12th. Clearly then, the only viable dates for Lorie being able to meet Bowie when she was 14 were in March 1973 at either Long Beach or West Hollywood, as she would have only been 13 at the time of the shows in Santa Monica and San Francisco in October 1972. And Lorie does confirm at the end of the interview that she hooked up with Bowie around the time of a Long Beach show specifically. So with this, it appears totally plausible then that she could have met Bowie when she was 14 at Long Beach in March 1973. However, this idea quickly becomes complicated by the fact that Lorie also contends that when she met Bowie at the age of 14, that they only talked and she rejected his initial advances. And it wasn't until around 5 months later, when Bowie was back in town for another gig, that they met again for a second time, where Lorie then engaged in a sexual relationship with Bowie, and also lost her virginity to him when she was either 14 or 15. She doesn't make this part on her age clear, and it also changes from story to story. Now, this doesn't make sense with the timeline we have, seeing as Bowie did not return to California again after the March 1973 performance until September 1974 on the Diamond Dogs tour, where then she would have been nearly 16 years old, but still 15 as some may correctly argue. But more importantly, the gap between the potential meetings would then be significantly more than the 5 months she specified in the interview. Adding to this, she also affirms that the whole ordeal of meeting Bowie first and then actually hooking up with him 5 months later was all during the Ziggy Stardust tour, which completely eliminates the already troubled theory that the meetings could have maybe been between the last set of Ziggy California dates at Long Beach in March 1973 and the first set of California dates on the Diamond Dogs tour in September 1974, as she could have maybe just been considerably mistaken about the 5-month period in between the meetings, and the fact that she asserted she lost her virginity to Bowie on their second meeting in Long Beach specifically. But this clearly cannot be the case anyways now. Nevertheless, her story could become plausible if we dispel with the idea that she was 14 when she first met him, as it is tenable for her to have first met Bowie when she was 13 going on 14 at the first set of California dates in October 1972 at either of the Santa Monica or San Francisco shows, seeing as her 14th birthday would have just been a month later in November. And then Lorie could have met Bowie for the second time and hooked up with him in March 1973 when she would have been 14 and Bowie would have been in town for the show in Long Beach. And to bolster this proposition, the gap between the October 1972 dates and the March 1973 dates is actually exactly 5 months. With that major problem accounted for then, her story does then tie in the timeline correctly and becomes feasible. Also, I must contend here that it's fair to give Lorie some benefit of the doubt for misremembering her age, as it is reasonable to explain these inconsistencies so far to just being forgetful, especially seeing as this whole alleged encounter would have taken place 40 years before the interview. Either way, the 5-month gap between the meetings and the shows, and also the inclusion of the Long Beach show specifically, were both remembered precisely by Lorie and fitted in correctly to a timeline after we accounted for the age problem. So with all that considered, her account still holds up in my eyes. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg of Lorie's many inconsistencies and contradictions. So remaining on the through this piece then, Lorie claims to have first met Bowie at a club where he propositioned her, but she rejected him, as we touched on earlier. Interestingly, she described Bowie at the time of their first meeting as having no eyebrows. Now, if we adhere to the fact that Lorie must have been 13 rather than 14 as she claimed when she first met Bowie at one of the October 1972 California dates, then this recount becomes massively flawed. The reason being is that most sources point towards Bowie shaving his eyebrows at the earliest around very late 1972, either round about the time of the Ziggy tour date in Dania, Florida in late November 1972, after Bowie decided to shave them off to look more like his idealised alien Ziggy character, as put forward in Nicholas Pegg's Bowie biography. Or instead, he shaved them some time after the rejection of the Drive-In Saturday single, in which Bowie allegedly retaliated to the rejection by shaving his eyebrows in a drunken fit. Staying on this subject, Bowie is known to have only even first started playing Drive-In Saturday at either the Dania show or a Phoenix show just prior in earlier November, which either way were both after the California dates in late October of that year. Furthermore, it is more than likely that in line with Bowie's own comments on VH1 Storytellers, where he says that,
and it's called Drive-In Saturday. Let me put my arms around your head. Gee, it's hot, let's go to bed. Don't forget to turn on the light. Don't laugh, babe, it'll be alright. Pour me out another phone. I'll ring and see if your friends are home. Perhaps the strange one.
Then the dispute and drunken retaliation about the single would have definitely happened in November 1972, around the time of a Dania, Florida show, seeing as Nicholas Pegg notes earlier in his Bowie biography how the band Mott the Hoople rejected the Drive-In Saturday single in November of 72, and how Bowie, in the VH1 Storytellers gig, as we just listened to, ascertained that the drunken shaving took place in Florida, And as I showed in the concert dates table just before, which I'll pop up again now, Bowie's only Florida stop for the entire Ziggy Stardust tour was in Dania in mid-November 1972. So if Bowie shaved his eyebrows off for this reason, rather than because he was trying to emulate an alien Ziggy visage, then the shaving must have occurred when he was in town for the Dania show in mid-November 1972. Either way, it doesn't matter what source we use for the reason why Bowie shaved his eyebrows, as they both put forward the date of the shaving taking place in November 1972, which is clearly after the California dates at Santa Monica and San Francisco in October 1972. Now we're off that tangent, we can conclude that it was essentially impossible for Lorie to have encountered Bowie with depilated eyebrows in October 1972 at the time of their first meeting. This little detail alone seriously challenges Lorie's reliability as a truthful storyteller. Moving on, Lorie claims that Bowie's security guard called her around 5 months later after their first meeting to facilitate a dinner date between her and Bowie when he was back in town for a show, which again ties in with the timeline if we are to believe that she was 13 rather than 14 when she first met Bowie at one of his October 1972 shows, which is the supposition we will continue to run with. Lorie exclaims that she asked her friend Sable Starr, another prolific baby groupie at the time, to come with her since Sable desperately wanted to sleep with Bowie. They both then took a limo ride to the Rainbow Club with the intention of meeting Bowie. After meeting each other, Lorie, Sable, Bowie and Bowie's security guard then all sat at a table in a private room. Lorie erroneously goes on to say that John Lennon and Yoko Ono stopped by at the table to say hello, which appears to be a totally brazen lie, seeing as it has been widely reported that Lennon and Bowie only even met for the first time at a party in September 1974. This therefore makes this detail a complete impossibility, as Lorie could have only met Bowie for the second time around the time of a Long Beach gig in March 1973, as we've already established, which is patently well before September 1974. And just to note, this 1974 meeting date between Lennon and Bowie is attested by Maypang's book Loving John, Roger Griffin's extensive recount of Bowie's life in the publishing David Bowie The Golden Years, and also several other web sources like Far Out Magazine and Bowie himself.
It's impossible for me to talk about popular music without mentioning of probably my greatest mentor, John Lennon. Thing about John with his sense of humour. Surrealistically enough, we were first introduced in about 1974 by Elizabeth Taylor. We were in LA and one night she had a party to which both John and I had been invited.
Moving on. After a run-in with some crazed hippie who threatened Bowie's life, they all went to the Beverly Hilton to Bowie's suite, where Bowie then personally propositioned Lorie alone to come to his bedroom, and Sable was furious at being rejected. Bowie is actually confirmed to have been staying at the Hyatt rather than the Hilton at the time, but this is a detail that could be easily confused, so I'll let it slide. She then described the encounter with Bowie, where she allegedly lost her virginity, in great detail, which I'm not going to read out for obvious reasons, but I will leave a screen cap of the quote here for you to read. Yep, pretty on the nose. 2 hours later, Lorie says she went to check on Sable, who was acting in a crazed manner due to rejection and what she perceived as Lorie's betrayal, as Sable was, quote, fogging up windows and writing, "I want to David." Lorie then went back to Bowie to talk to him about the situation, and Bowie said, quote, "Well, darling, bring her in reference to Sable, and they proceeded to then have a threesome. The next morning, they were apparently nearly caught by Angie Bowie, David's then wife, as she was banging on the door. Funnily enough, There are other versions of the story where Angie was actually part of a threesome. Lorie also conducted another interview piece in the 2007 book, Let's Spend the Night Together, which was written by fellow groupie Pamela DeBar. Lorie maintains a very similar story to a Thrillist piece, so that's why I've grouped these interviews together here, as she again adheres to the narrative that there was 2 meetings between the pair, with a half-year gap between them, and also nearly every other detail like the run-in with the crazy fam, with the only minor difference across these interviews being that there was no mention of any run-in with Angie the next day. Intriguingly, she does again say she was a virgin when her and Bowie hooked up on their second meeting. Again returning to a Thrillist piece, Lorie ends her part on Bowie, saying that she, quote, saw David many times after that for the next 10 years, and it was always great, which appears to me as either an embellishment or a complete fabrication, as Bowie only came to California 3 more times across the next 10 years, with him returning to Los Angeles and San Diego in the aforementioned Diamonds Dog Tour in 1974, then coming back 2 years later during the Insular Tour, where he stopped off at Daly City, Inglewood, and San Diego in 1976, and finally during the Insular 2 World Tour, where he played several shows at San Diego, Fresno, Inglewood, and Oakland in 1978. Also, even if she had met him another few times, surely there would have been some photographic evidence of these meetings between the pair, as Bowie was an international superstar at this point, and was always under intense media scrutiny for his purported bisexuality and morally transgressive image. Likewise, after the summer of 1973, Lorie had also achieved infamy as a prolific baby groupie, stemming from a relationship with another rock star, which we will go into more detail about later. So surely, someone would have snapped a picture of these two at some point. And also, just to clarify, there is not one picture of Bowie and Lorie anywhere, or even a picture of them not together but at the same event or venue, which again puts even more question marks over Lorie's claims. All things considered then, according to this version of events, the encounter still seems slightly probable, but quite unlikely given the vast array of inconsistencies, fabrications, and contradictions in this version of events. But there is definitely still some lineal consistency with the timelines of when Bowie would have been in California, the meeting at a Long Beach show in March 1973, and the nearly half-year break between the 2 sets of California dates. With that said, we will now move on to a different version of events that Lorie presents in a video interview, which complicates things even further. I remember seeing a video interview with Lorie a bit over a year ago where she spoke about her encounter with Bowie, but despite saving the URL link, which I will leave in the description of this video, I cannot find the video anywhere online, so I'm going to have to go off a mixture of my memory from the video and another source that summarises the interview. If anyone can get this video for me, or has any extra information about it, please leave a comment on the video and I'll get right back to you. Anyways, Lorie first noted how Bowie wanted to take her to dinner, which is a detail that coincides with both the Thrillist interview and the Pamela interview. However, across the interview, Lorie never once mentioned Sable being with her for any of the time spent with Bowie, making it appear as if only herself and Bowie were present for their romantic entanglement. This is a fundamental shift in her recount, which cannot be put down to misremembering. Lorie goes on to mention that they were taken to a Long Beach arena show to watch Bowie play, which does tie into the timeline, seeing as Bowie returned to California, and Long Beach in particular, in the second leg of the Ziggy tour in March 1973, 5 months after the first round of shows in October 1972, as we established earlier. But again, remember, this whole proposition rests on the fact that she was actually 13 when she first met Bowie at the earlier California shows in October 1972, rather than 14 as she claimed in the Thrillist interview. Lorie then claims that Bowie thanked her for being at the show and even shone a spotlight on her. This appears to be a total lie, as the show at Long Beach can be found in its entirety online, and there is nothing to suggest that this happened. Likewise, there are zero accounts from any people who were at this show saying she was even there. Finally, there is absolutely zero mention of her losing her virginity to Bowie in this encounter, which is a pretty big detail to exclude. In an interview with Peter Gilman in 1986, from the Bowie biography, alias David Bowie, Lorie does mostly adhere to a similar timeline to a Thrillist and Pamela interviews. But as you will see, there will be some significant contradictions and inconsistencies with this version of events that greatly challenge her overall claim. For instance, Lorie first attests that she was at the Rainbow Club the night before Bowie was to perform at Long Beach, which therefore places this encounter in March 1973, where Bowie is then said to have spotted Lorie afar from across the club. However, there is zero mention in this recount that Lorie had ever met Bowie previously. It instead appears as if Bowie was seeing Lorie for the first time at the Rainbow here, which contradicts the narrative she painted in the Thrillist and Pamela interviews, where she detailed first meeting Bowie and refusing his advances when he was in town for presumably an October 1972 show, and then meeting him again and having a sexual relationship with him 5 months later at a later show in purportedly Long Beach, which, as I will repeat again, was a supposition already complicated by her adherences to being 14 at the time of their first meeting, which was found to be impossible. Though I will maintain it appears doubtful from the way Lorie's recount reads here. People may still argue that in this interview there was actually no point where Lorie outright denies the occurrence of two separate meetings between herself and Bowie, as the first meeting and what we believe to be in October 1972, 5 months prior, may not have been mentioned, as Lorie may have seen it as trivial or not relevant, or it could have even been left out of the edit by Gilman, which would then totally rebut this notable inconsistency. However, in regards to this, Lorie says that she, quote, had this shock because Bowie had no eyebrows. Now, this makes zero sense and invalidates that counter-argument, as Lorie claimed in a Thrillist interview that she saw Bowie with no eyebrows in their first meeting at an earlier show, presumably in October 1972, where she initially rejected his advances. And it's already incredibly doubtful whether Bowie had even shaved his eyebrows at this point, seeing as how we established earlier that the shaving took place at least 1 month on from this first encounter, sometime in November of that year, around the time of a show in Dania, Florida. But anyways, let's just say his eyebrows were shaved at the time of this October 1972 show, like she claimed. Then if they were to meet again at this later show in Long Beach in March 1973, why would she be so incredibly shocked at his depilated eyebrows that she's already purported to have seen before, 5 months prior? This more or less confirms that in this version of events, there was no first meeting between the pair, and it wasn't included in this account as it simply wasn't part of this version of her story. Beyond this, a good amount of the rest of this interview matches with the Thrillist and Pamela version of events. As for instance, Sable is now again with Lorie, and Sable is just as ferociously avid to meet Bowie. But one big difference from the Thrillist and Pamela pieces is that there is no mention that Lorie was a virgin or lost her virginity to Bowie at any point. That's a pretty big detail to exclude. Another small difference is how Bowie is said to have asked his security guard to invite Lorie to his hotel, rather than them both going together as they did in the Thrillist piece. Sable is then said to beg Lorie if she can come as well, to which Lorie agrees. They then arrive at Bowie's suite, where Lorie again describes him in the same precise detail as she did in the Thrillist and Pamela interviews, as wearing a red kimono. Bowie then asks just Lorie and not Sable to come to his bathroom, where the same story about Lorie washing him is told in very similar detail as to her other accounts. The recounting of these specific details about what Bowie was wearing and the washing story across multiple interviews does, in my eyes, at least partially reinstate Lorie's credibility as a reliable storyteller. Lorie then says that they went at it for, quote, 5 or 6 hours, which is a bit different from the couple of hours told in previous accounts. And let's be honest, that has to be an embellishment. Who's really going at it for 5 or 6 hours? Feeling guilty about Sable being left in the main room, she then convinced the reluctant Bowie to have sex with Sable individually. But not a threesome, like she put forward in the Thrillist and Pamela interviews. And also, remember, Sable wasn't even suggested as part of the entanglement in any capacity in the deleted video interview from just before. So this new shift in her many stories throws another significant contradiction in the works for Lorie's claim. Plus, are we really meant to believe that Sable waited in the same hotel suite directly next door to where Lorie and Bowie were allegedly going at it for 5 or 6 hours, until Bowie finally invited her in? This seems incredibly improbable to me. Nonetheless, Lorie does assert the same story about Sable having an unhinged episode after being initially rejected, just like in the previous interviews, saying how she was fogging up windows and scrawling out, "I wanna f*** David Bowie." The piece concludes with Lorie and Sable sneaking out the next day before Angie Bowie was set to arrive, which is a much different retelling to how Angie was apparently furiously banging on the door in the Thrillist piece, or how there was no mention of Angie at all in the Pamela interview. Again with this interview, there are details in certain places that corroborate with Lorie's other accounts and match up with the timeline, but there is so much contradiction at critical junctures of her story, paired with some obvious embellishments here and there, that together make her encounter with Bowie one that is very dubious at this point. In Paul Trynka's 2011 David Bowie biography, Starman, Lorie gives a brief but completely different version of her encounter with Bowie. Lorie says her and an unnamed friend, presumably Sable, stuck into Bowie's hotel room in what I gathered as a few days before a show in Santa Monica, which must have been in October 1972, during the first California leg of the Ziggy tour. Lorie says Bowie at the time was too tired and hesitant to do anything with them at first, but was eventually convinced to have sex with them before Lorie and her friend snuck out of his room. This version of events is a completely different recount to anything previous, and it also makes no sense time-wise. First then, if she was to have had a romantic entanglement with Bowie at this time in October of 1972, then she would have been only 13 years old, an age she has never claimed to have been when she got with Bowie. Adding to this, it is pretty well established by both Lorie herself and from the accounts of others that she only started actively sleeping with rock stars as a baby groupie after she turned 14 anyways, which abnegates this already incredibly dubious version of events even more so. Furthermore, this story comprehensively contradicts the narrative painted in every one of her interviews so far, that she hooked up with Bowie when he was in town for a Long Beach show on the return leg of his tour in March 1973, which has been one of the only consistent and corroborable details across each of her stories so far. To paradox things further, in both the Peter Gilman interview and from what I remember from the deleted video interview, there was no mention in either of these accounts of Lorie even meeting Bowie around the time of his October 1972 show. As in these version of events, Lorie hooked up with Bowie straight after meeting him when Bowie was in town for a Long Beach show in March of 1973. I don't even need to go into much detail about how disparately different Lorie's and Bowie's actual sexual encounter was, as instead of the loose narrative painted across most of the interviews so far of Bowie meeting Lorie and Sable at the Rainbow Club, and then initially singling out Lorie for a one-on-one entanglement, now the story is that Lorie and presumably Sable ambushed Bowie into a threesome. Also, once again, there is no mention of her losing her virginity to Bowie here, which is a detail, and a big detail at that has only appeared so far in the Thrillist and Pamela retellings. This recount is so far removed from any version of events that Lorie's presented so far that it's hard to even gauge any sense of truth, fact, or honesty in this illicit affair now. Lorie has created a gaping paradox. The only potential rebuttal Lorie has from this version of her story is that the interview was very short, so maybe some important details could have been left out of the final edit. But again, what we do have from this interview still contradicts nearly every other version of her story that we've encountered so far. Interestingly, Sable Starr gave an interview about her run-in with Bowie in the book The Uncensored Oral History of Punk. Her recount is one so different to any of Lorie's versions that there is almost no overlap at all. Sable does not give any dates, but says that Bowie came into town just before a show in Long Beach, which then firmly places this entanglement in March 1973, much like nearly all of Lorie's stories so far. She exclaims that Bowie wanted to meet her, and her specifically, and that he was staying at the Hilton, which oddly enough is the only correct recount of where Bowie was actually staying so far across any of the interviews. Sable never actually confirms Lorie's presence at any point, but does attest that Bowie was sexually interested in both Sable and Lorie and wanted to hook up with them both. Sable continues, saying that they went to sit at an upstairs table at the Rainbow. Lorie may have been sitting at the table with Bowie and Sable, but it isn't clear, as Sable says, quote, "Me and David were sitting there with a couple of other people." Intriguingly, she also brings up in detail an incident with some erratic hippie who was threatening to kill Bowie at one of his later shows, in almost the exact same detail as how Lorie described an incident with a crazed fan in the Thrillist and Pamela interviews. And further to this, in the 1986 Alias David Bowie book by Peter Gilman, which we looked at just before, just a paragraph prior to Lorie's interview, revered producer and musician Kim Foley also detailed about a run-in with a hostile fan, who again threatened Bowie at the time of this Long Beach show. The retelling of this event by both Lorie and Sable in such precise detail, alongside Kim Foley further substantiating the incident, does somewhat legitimise the idea that Lorie and Sable may have in fact met Bowie at this March 1973 show at Long Beach, as otherwise, how could they both recount this specific and seemingly insignificant event at the same location at the Rainbow Club with such accuracy all these years later? After this, Sable's story then diverges significantly from any of Lorie's versions, as Sable says she and Bowie both made it back to his hotel room after the hippie incident, where just Sable and Bowie then went at it for hours, and she says she didn't even know where Lorie was at the time of their entanglement. This is Sable's only interview on the matter, and no other version of this story anywhere has ever painted Sable as having a one-on-one encounter with Bowie, nor the fact that Bowie was planning to meet Sable specifically. But what I will say is that Sable did definitely have more notoriety in the groupie scene at the time, seeing as she was well known to have been with Iggy Pop and many other rock stars before her and Bowie would have met in assumedly March 1973, whereas Lorie was relatively new to the scene by her own admission and would have certainly have had less clout in the scene. There was a lot to take in with this one, as it throws yet another spanner in the works. Though each of the interviews so far have all collectively shed serious doubt over Lorie and even Sable's relations with Bowie, there is one more issue that more or less invalidates the alleged encounter with Bowie altogether. That is, Jimmy Page. For those not aware, Jimmy Page was the lead guitarist of Led Zeppelin, probably the biggest band on the planet in the 1970s, and it is a well-established fact that Lorie most likely did indeed have a sexual relationship with Page that lasted for many months, which will be a story for another video later down the line. It is presumed Lorie and Page first started a sexual relationship in early June of 1973, round about the time of Led Zeppelin's tour dates in California. The Bowie encounter appears to be somewhat plausible then, at least in line with the majority of Lorie's accounts, which so far point towards hooking up with Bowie in March 1973, when he was in town for a Long Beach show. But there is one major flaw in this timeline. Lorie has repeatedly stated that she was a virgin when she met Jimmy Page, which patently wouldn't be possible if she slept with Bowie first before Page, as the encounter with Bowie could have only taken place in March 1973, which is obviously months before she would have first hooked up with Page, in the summer of 1973. Yes, Lorie did claim to lose her virginity to Bowie in the Thrillist and Pamela interviews, but these are the only times in her many different stories where she claimed this was the case. On the other hand, Lorie said on frequent occasions, such as in this 2009 video interview, that she was a virgin when she met Page.
What happened was I guess Led Zeppelin came to town and had seen all these photos, and Jimmy had made a call to Lee Childer saying, I want to meet Lori Maddox. So next thing you know, we were taking a drive down to the Hyatt house to go meet the band, and I was terrified because, first of all, I was still, I was a baby. Come on,
As well as saying she was a virgin in the Hammer of the Gods Led Zeppelin biography, when Page first interacted with her in the summer of 1973, and that she never slept with any rock stars beside Jimmy, which in essence totally buries the Bowie case altogether. Even the book, Jimmy Page, The Definitive Biography, and B.B. Buell's biography, who, just to quickly note, was the woman who Jimmy Page left Lorie for, both put forward that Lorie gave herself exclusively to Page between the ages of 14 to 16. This then also totally contradicts the timeline of events we have painted so far, as it has been very well established at this point by Lorie through nearly all of her interviews that she hooked up with Bowie around the time of a Long Beach show in March 1973, at which time she would have been 14 years of age. So, how could she have given herself exclusively to Page from the ages of 14 to 16 if this were the case? With these revelations now, it seems like Lorie's claims have now become almost completely improbable, and they're already incredibly dubious before this. I feel it is also important to mention how uncharacteristic it would seem of Bowie to have a sexual relationship with a minor, considering the boatloads of good character evidence that directly opposes him partaking in such behaviours. For example, there is existing hearsay evidence that on an unspecified tour, he threatened to fire his drummer for directing teenage girls to his hotel room. Furthermore, according to one of the commentaries of a 1986 Jim Henson film, Labyrinth, a kiss scene was originally written for Bowie, but he refused to do it because his co-star, Jennifer Connelly, was only 14 at the time. Also, when Bowie was part of the band Tin Machine, he wrote the song Shopping for Girls as part of the band's 1991 album, which was about bringing awareness to child prostitution in Thailand. So, is David Bowie a child predator who statutorily raped Lori Maddox, or maybe even Sable Starr, in March 1973, when he was in town for a show at Long Beach? I'd say almost certainly not. There are simply way too many contradictions between major details of her many different stories, such as who was actually present for the sex act, when the act took place, her age for her different encounters with Bowie, and most importantly, the Jimmy Page problem, which more or less invalidates her supposed relationship with Bowie. Furthermore, there are times where Lorie embellishes or even completely fabricates details in her own stories, such as alleging to meet John Lennon and Yoko in 1973, or seeing Bowie with shaved eyebrows in October 1972, which were both essentially impossible at the time, and seriously question her veracity as a reliable storyteller. What I will say though is that there is definitely some continuity and factual evidence that support the narrative of Lorie and Sable meeting Bowie at the time of a Long Beach show in March 1973, which has been a common trope across all the interviews that is only contradicted by the Paul Trynka interview. This makes me inclined to believe that maybe Lorie and Sable did in fact meet Bowie when he was in town for the Long Beach show, but I believe that they just met and that was it, as everything that happened after this part of the story, such as what hotel they went to, who actually partook in the act and how long it lasted, or whether Angie made an appearance before Lorie and Sable left the next morning, is never consistently accounted. There is something else that also needs touching on that cannot be ignored in my conclusion, and that is the seemingly habitual embellishments and fabrications of groupies in their retellings of their encounters with rock stars. At this point, it is well established that many groupies often like to sensationalise their run-ins with rock stars, often vivifying any anecdotes they have to make their relationship seem more important or crazier than they actually were, and any conjecture in their stories can quickly be refuted by some actual research into the matter. Lorie has also been shown to be guilty of doing the same thing with Mick Jagger, alongside many other rock stars, most notably Jimmy Page, which is something I will go into much more detail about in a later video. But for now, just be aware that Lorie has gone on record to have likely fabricated many of the details of her likely real relationship with Page, such as when they first met, where they first met, how long they were dating for, and how close she really was to Jimmy, as well as when they split up, and even fabricating the dates of pictures of herself and Jimmy. As a betting man then, I would put good money on Bowie having never slept with either Lorie or Sable. But would I totally discount them meeting briefly in March 1973 at the Rainbow Club around the time of a Long Beach gig? No, I would not. Obviously then, I cannot comprehensively rule out that Bowie did indeed statutorily rape either Lorie or Sable, but from my research, it does seem highly unlikely that that was the case. And with this then, if Lorie has indeed fabricated this entire relationship with Bowie, then she needs to be held accountable for falsifying multiple unfounded claims that could not just tarnish, but completely erode and defame Bowie's legacy as one of music's biggest icons. In spite of this, I am aware that in my country that it would be impossible for Lorie to face any civil proceedings for libel or slander, as you cannot sue for the defamation of an already deceased person, and you can't generally sue for defamation of a living person based solely on their association with a deceased person who has been defamed. So for instance, Bowie's widow, Iman Abdul-Mahid, who is domiciled in the UK, would not be able to sue for defamation of David Bowie and the Bowie name by association. However, a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights in 2013 for the Putistin versus Ukraine case did suggest that under Article 8 of the Human Rights Convention, which is the right to respect for private and family life, that in exceptional circumstances, the damage to the reputation of a deceased person can affect the private life of that person's surviving family members. US state defamation law, which might be more pertinent to Lorie's potential defamation here, follows much of the same precedent as UK law, but as far as I could see, only the states of Nevada, Georgia, and Idaho, but not the state of California where Lorie resides and where a hypothetical civil action would likely manifest, contain provisions for family members claiming on behalf of a deceased family member, if such family members feel that their honour has been tarnished or their feelings of respect and admiration have been violated and blackened. And even if the defamation lawsuit hypothetically was to be heard in the federal courts rather than the California state courts, so as to bypass California's lack of legislation for close relatives of the deceased, it would first need to satisfy the effects tests, and the potential damages recoverable would need to exceed $75,000. But even if it did satisfy these requirements, there will be no case, as at federal law there are no statutes for defamation lawsuits of the deceased. But more importantly, even if Lorie's most recent interview in 2015 with Thrillist.com, which we looked at earlier, was somehow deemed as an applicable document to file a liable proceedings around by Bowie's close relatives, it would no longer be a valid document for such an action, as the limitation period would have expired several years ago, seeing as defamation lawsuits in California and even the UK become statute barred after 12 months. So then, we can only really hold Lorie accountable for her seemingly baseless accusations by spreading awareness on his platform and enlightening others on the serial fabulist that Lorie appears to be. Hopefully then, this video can now quash this besmirching speculation and condemnation about Bowie being a child predator. And unless a new credible claim against Bowie comes up in the future, we can go back to celebrating Bowie for the music legend that he is without feeling any guilt for the unfounded allegations that have been attached to him for many years now. So, that's everything for today. Thank you very, very much for watching this very lengthy video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to hear your opinions, thoughts, or even extra bits of information that I may have missed out in the comments section below. Share this with your friends and family, like the video if you enjoyed, and always remember to subscribe to the Sing Swan Song.